Hey everyone, my name is Tyler, and in this experiment, we'll be focusing on how exactly oil pollution can affect wildlife, and in this case, specifically ducks. This kind of pollution is an important topic of discussion because oil is used for so many different things in everyday life. What are some uses for oil that you can think of? Did any of these things come to mind? People use oil for running machinery like cars and airplanes, as well as for building roads. Although oil could be incredibly useful for a variety of different things, there are some dangerous side effects that come with using this material. Oil can end up making its way into the watery habitats of creatures such as this duck here. As you can see in this picture, its feathers are coated in oil, which is something that can happen if a duck comes into contact with oil-polluted water. Also, if a creature like this ends up ingesting the oil, it can cause very serious health risks for them as well. This experiment will showcase what it looks like when an animal's feathers are coated in oil and what happens to them, as well as the most effective way to clean this material off of the animals. We'll need a few basic materials in order to get started on the project. The materials that we'll need are vegetable or olive oil, cocoa powder, and crafting feathers. The oil and cocoa powder combined together will create the makeshift oil for the experiment. We'll also need some liquid cleaning detergent for the second half of the experiment. We'll also need 2 bowls, pans, or trays of water in order to replicate the watery habitats of the animals. To start the experiment off, you want to take one of the white feathers and prepare to lay it gently on top of one of the trays of water. Before you do this, I want you to make a prediction. Do you think that the feather will float or sink when you place it on top of the water? Now that you've made your prediction, let's see what happens. As you can see, the feather is floating gently on top of the water. For this next step, we're going to create the oil that will pollute one of our makeshift water habitats. And for this, you'll take your vegetable or olive oil and pour half a cup of it into a glass. Next, we're going to take about 1 tablespoon of the cocoa powder and dump it into our half a cup of oil. Once it's in there, we're going to take our spoon and mix it all together. It should end up looking like this. Once you have your makeshift oil ready, we're going to take that half a cup of oil and pour it over our second tray of water. And as you can see, the oil is spreading out over the surface of the water. If you look closely at our habitat, you'll notice that the oil and water layers actually don't mix naturally together. They stay as 2 completely separate layers. Alright, it's time to make another prediction. Do you think that the feather will sink or float when it's placed onto the top of the oily water? Go ahead and grab the feather from before and gently place it on top of the oily water. Observe how the feather is not able to float as easily due to being covered in oil, which makes it sink slightly below the surface. This same thing can happen to an animal when their feathers are coated in oil, making movement much more difficult. Now we're going to see what happens when that same feather is placed back into the pure water dish. Do you think that the feather will still float, or will it sink as it just did previously? Let's see what happens. Go ahead and grab your feather and place it gently back into the pure water bowl. As you can see, the feather is still sinking slightly below the surface, as it is still being weighed down by the oil. Now for part 2 of the experiment, we're going to view the most effective way of cleaning oil off of an animal's feathers. For this first method, we're going to take the feather that we had previously and rinse it with just pure water that comes from our sink. Just using water from the sink doesn't effectively clean the feather, so we'll have to find another way to remove the oil slick. For this next part, we're going to try using detergent soap to clean the oil slick off the feather. Make a prediction of whether this will work more effectively or the same as the previous method. Apply the liquid detergent to the feather and once again rinse it under the faucet. You can see here that the soap is doing an excellent job of cleaning the oil off of the feather. And by the end of it, your feather should be completely clean with almost no traces of oil left. The reason why objects such as the feather are able to float on the water in the first place is due to a concept called surface tension. Water molecules form hydrogen bonds with other water molecules, creating a layer that's strong and flexible, allowing objects to float on top of the water. Objects must be less dense than the water below them to be able to float. This can be seen in our experiment with the feathers, as when they got covered in oil, they became much more dense and were weighed down by the oil, causing them to slightly sink below the surface. Oil pollution of natural environments can happen in a variety of different ways. One of the most common ones is when oil leaks out from vehicles on highways. This oil can end up leaking onto the highway and then end up finding its way into natural habitats that are close by. I'm sure many of you have seen oil puddles like this on the road before. If this oil ends up leaking out into natural nearby areas, it can end up harming the plants and animals that live in it, especially if it enters watery areas like streams or ponds. Another common way that oil pollution can occur is when oil tankers are involved in accidents that cause oil to be spilled out in large amounts into the ocean. The oil spill can spread out very rapidly, as we saw in our experiment with our makeshift oil when we dumped it into our tray of water, just on a much larger scale. This oil spill can cause many problems for the ocean's creatures, especially if they end up ingesting it, or if they're simply coated in it and their movement is heavily inhibited, such as we saw in our experiment with the feathers. These spills often wash up on shorelines, creating huge messes that only large cleanup crews can clean. Thank you for taking part in this experiment, and hopefully I gave you some new insight into just exactly how animals such as ducks can be affected by oil pollution.